Welcome to the Social Mobility Commission podcast. This is our first one, and I am interviewing Lee Elliot Major on parenting because we know just how important parenting is for social mobility. So yeah, I should tell the audience that this is Lee's book, and it's the reason why I invited you. It's called The Good Parent Educator. And, you know, it's interesting because you are, I think, considered to be a man of the left, although you might say you're a man of the center. And people would say that I'm much more of a conservative. But when I read this, I found I was agreeing with much of what you were saying. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating, actually, that, you know, I think a lot of people would just imagine you and I would disagree.
I think so. I mean, I wrote that book, you know, because I'm convinced that, one, you know, parenting matters for social mobility. You know, if you look at any study, we know that outcomes are driven by out-of-school factors as well as in-school factors on average, right? Some schools do buck the trend, but on average, the home environment is absolutely crucial. And yet, it's like a taboo subject, I feel, in social mobility. So when I talk to ministers, you know, to be frank, they don't respond to some of the suggestions I've had over the years. And my view is that we've got this kind of sort of education arms race where, to be frank, you know, the middle classes are investing ever more resources, as I have done as a parent, right? You know, tutoring, helping your children, advocating for your children. And I feel like, if we can call them the middle classes, there's a whole debate about what is class these days, but broadly speaking, the middle classes, I feel, are pulling away. And yet, we're not being explicit about the things that all parents should be doing with their children, and I fear that many children will be falling further behind because of that.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And why do you think, 'cause, I mean, I have my own ideas about why politicians don't really talk about parenting. I sort of feel it's because they know these are the people who are voting for them. And so whichever, it doesn't matter which type of politician, any party, they never talk about parenting because they wouldn't want to risk the votes. What do you think?
I think ministers tend to be worried about telling parents what to do. That's the response I get. But I think it's a national scandal. I have to say, you know, there are too many parents who are not given the information of what you can do to help your children. It seems to me that's not a political issue for me. That's just a fundamental issue of social mobility.
Exactly. And so it's a really good point there. You're saying if you don't know certain things, it's very difficult for a family to enable social mobility for their child because they don't have access to that knowledge. So what sorts of things? I mean, you write about the early years, you write about reading. What kind of big ticket things are there? If some of our audience are people with small children, what do you think they should be doing?
So one of the things, and I know you've spoken about this as well, you know, daily reading. I mean, the research, and I looked at loads of research on this, it's about 15, 20 minutes a day. Yeah. Below that, you know, you don't see as much impact. I think just sitting down with your children, asking them questions. You know, some parents might not themselves have had good experiences at school and might not be able to read as well as others. But I think that the actual act of just sitting down with your children and shared reading, I suppose I'd call it. And that actually can be impactful all through the years, by the way, but particularly in the early years. So that's one thing I would say we need to work hard at. And I think we should have public campaigns on this. I think all schools, maybe primary schools and secondary schools, should have explicit parent engagement strategies that should be a very prominent part of each school. We might get into what schools can do. So reading is one thing. I think routines is another thing that really comes up again and again. So if you sit down, I mean, it was really interesting here, sitting down for lunch here at Michaela, because it was a great experience in many ways. But what we find from the research is that, you know, that act of sitting down with your mum or your dad or whoever it is, routinely, and eating and having a bit of a discussion about something, is a very strong proxy or signal for better outcomes.
Yes. So and you'd say what, once a day, in the evening, at dinner?
Yeah, if possible, yeah. You know, and I struggled with this as a parent, to be honest. We have two teenagers. Often they would wear headphones when we were having. We would say, "Look, sorry, can you take off your headphones?" Right? You know, I think this is applied.
that you call them headphones. But it sort of dates you, because I don't think your teenagers would call them headphones. But anyway,
that's probably right. I say disco as well, things like that. But yeah, I think this applies for all parents, right? And I do, you know, a lot of my work, as you know, is about class divides. And I think in a way we should put away the class discussions, and this should be about what works. Yeah. And I really think that should be the debate.
Okay, and so you're talking about the kind of 3, 4, 5-year-olds. What about the 2-year-olds? What about the little ones who don't yet speak? What advice would you have for parents with that age child?
So I'm less of an expert on that, but what I found reviewing the research was there was lots of discussion about what we call oracy, you know, just talking with your children. I mean, I'm a musician, so I played guitar a lot with my children. I have this theory that helped them in some way. But, you know, you're talking with your children, even if they're not responding in some ways. I think you're giving them sort of, you know, they're hearing that language. Yeah. So I think this idea of talking with your children is really important at those early ages.
Well, and what you say there, I often say something similar, which is that you've taken something, you like the guitar, so you shared that with your children. Somebody else might like cooking, somebody might like board games, whatever it is, you do the thing that you really enjoy with them, and you talk a lot about it. And I think one of the problems sometimes for some families is that it's a bit odd speaking to a child all the time who doesn't respond. You know, and for some families, I think, well, obviously, you see the toddler, hello, how are you? What have you been doing today? I've been to the park. Oh, I bet you've been somewhere interesting. And it's a bit odd because you're responding for the child. And if you're not used to that, how are you meant to know that that's what you should do? And of course, if you don't, I mean, in terms of what you know of the research and so on, what happens if the child isn't spoken to a lot when they're younger? What do you find? I mean, I know anecdotally what I find in schools.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, again, you know, I've seen lots of different researches on, and anecdotally, I find, you know, I've got older children now. You know, when you compare the private versus state schools on average, what really strikes me is that the private school, on average, are just much more, it's not just being articulate, they're able to converse with me in a way, by the way, that some of your students did here today, I have to say. And, you know, I think that is a real skill, actually.
Yes.
And I would argue these things, again, aren't, you know, I'm not superimposing some sort of middle class values on this. I just think that is a life skill that we should all have to some extent, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is what, when I talk about parenting skills, if you like, it's about those core things that are associated with very positive life outcomes. Yeah. And by the way, you know, when I talk about life outcomes, I guess I'm talking, you know, another scandal in our country, I think, is we have, you know, around 30% of children that leave school without basic numeracy and literacy. Yeah. You know, I think every child should have those basics.
I agree.
And are able to converse with an adult. I don't think that's too hard an ask.
Yes. Well, and of course you sat at lunch, and when you say they were able to talk to you in a way that you found impressive, it's what we do at lunchtime here. Every day they're able to sit down, they're given a topic for conversation, and then they're learning how to have a meal and talk to each other. And that might be because it's not necessarily happening at home. For some of them it is, for some of them it isn't. And so, you know, for our viewers who are parents, as you're saying, it's just so important to do that sort of stuff because it builds those social skills that you say school is there for, and you need that built at home as well. Okay, so other things I wanted to ask you about. You talked about choosing schools and what kinds of, you know, what advice do you have? My friends come up to me and they say, you know, especially when it comes to secondary school, they don't know which school, how do they know which school is better than the other school? I always tell them to go and look at the bus stop and see what the kids are like outside the school. What advice would you give to families?
So one of the things I think it is important to go and visit the school. And I would ask some really good questions. So one of the things we know, there's a stronger variation in teaching within each school than between schools. So what do I mean by that? So in every school, there probably are some really good teaching going on. Yeah. But there's also teaching that needs improvement, I'll put it that way, right? And there's probably even here, you know, although I have to say there was a lot of consistency in the classrooms that I observed today. But, for parents, I would ask the senior teacher or head teacher, how are you improving teaching across the school? Because, teaching can always be improved. And in a way, it's kind of interesting to get the answer. There's not any right or wrong answer in a way, but I'd be really interested to know what the head teacher says. Because that should be this. Every school is always thinking about that. I think I'll ask former pupils and parents about the school. One of the problems is with league tables is they're historical, right? That is so the school can change quite a lot. Because that is historical in a sense, so you've got to be really careful with those.
Explain what you mean for viewers. What do you mean?
So a league table is ranks a school on their GCSE or A-level results for secondary school, but those will be children that have already left and that started school 7 years ago. So in a way, what you're trying to do is find out what's happening now, because schools can change quite a lot. So I would, I'm the sort of hardest, I guess, parent of all. I used to go around. One of the questions I had, I remember, was, "What's your selection policy here?" So a lot of schools still do setting, and I would say, okay, and now setting can be done poorly and well, but I would ask, how are you doing it? Why do you do it in maths and not English, etc.?
And what kind of answer did you want to hear?
Well, I wanted a justification that if you're doing something like setting, that there is genuine flexibility in that setting, so that you are assessing children all through. So there is movement between the sets. Okay. Far too often, what you see in schools is you get those sets that are stuck, and it's very hard. So good schools are schools that are constantly appraising where their children are in their development.
Yeah. Okay, good. And what about homework? What would you say whenever I'm speaking to parents? Their thing is, oh my goodness, the homework, how do I get them to do it? Especially as they get older. So when they're smaller, they're more willing, more pliable. But then when they're 14, 15, they don't want to do it. What kind of advice do you have for parents around homework?
So there's this thing called the 10-minute rule in homework from education research. And that is that you shouldn't spend more than 10 minutes a night on homework for each year group. So if you're year one, you shouldn't do more than 10 minutes. By end of sixth form, you might challenge me on this. By end of sixth form, it shouldn't be more than 2 hours a night. The reason that is said is that you get these diminishing returns. Children, we all can only concentrate for so much time, right? So if you're doing 2 hours of intensive homework each evening over and above school, for many children that's a lot. So you get less of an impact the more you're doing it. It's difficult, I think, for secondary schools because you've got all these different departments setting homework at different times. But I think in some ways less is more. It's about, like, all these things in education. It's about the quality.
I agree, and 100%. And sometimes schools set all sorts of ridiculous homework where they're just coloring things in or whatever it is, and that's silly. But if it's good quality homework, what we often try and push here is the Pomodoro Technique, where we'll say 20-25 minutes, you do your work, then you take a 10-minute break, and you use a little timer, so you time yourself at 20-25 minutes, because the child knows that the end is in sight, and then it goes ding, and then they think, whoopee, I've got my 10-minute break, but you time the break, and they can do whatever they want, and then they come back to it, so it's broken up a bit more. We would push for a bit more than 2 up at GCSE level and A level. You're looking more at about 3, but they would split it up, and we would support them with homework schedules and being careful. I mean, it's a big thing that we're actually looking at in the school right now in terms of the homework and making sure that it is of good quality. Because as you say, if it isn't, then we're just wasting their time. And I know parents can get frustrated, very frustrated with homework that they feel is a bit silly and isn't helping their kid.
It either has to prepare the child for the next lesson or consolidate what's happening in the previous lesson. If it's not doing that, it's not particularly useful. At primary school, by the way, there's a lot of it that suggests it's not impactful at all. I suggest that's because it's not very well done. Yes. There's always these caveats to education research. What I'd say for parents, though, is I think you can help even at secondary school in terms of just time management, for example, or asking questions. And one thing you can do as a parent, even if you don't know the maths or because it gets quite difficult at those is to ask questions. You can do so. The best thing we found for revision is asking questions. So a lot of pupils I see who are doing the sort of highlighting and the rewriting, which it's not testing you. So I think if parents can, and I did this with my children. I remember doing the times tables with them, and I would test them all through. But trying to do it in a fun way, he says. I remember with my daughter, we used to do sort of a trampolining on the bed, making a mess of the bed while trying to ask her. So I think teachers know all these tricks, by the way. I think what I would stress with all this, though, that as a parent, don't think you can be a teacher, because I do speak to some parents and they think that they can teach because, it's one of these strange things. I would see it as one of the greatest professions, and it's, and yet, I have all sorts of friends who sort of think that they have opinions about how teaching should be done, who have had no training in teaching. And it just seems to be prey to that sort of thinking that you can teach. And I can tell you, because I've tried it a few times, it's much harder than you think. So that's something I think you've got to be careful of. You as a parent, I think you can do some things, but you can't teach.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about reviewing things and helping them learn stuff, but it's not the same as teaching, as you say. And I just wonder, when and why would you ever support homeschooling?
So I'm not a fan of homeschooling. I'm trying to think what I said in the book now, but I think the context of that book was written during the pandemic when there was a lot of homeschooling going on. I'm not a fan because I think schools are not just about academic learning, they're about socialisation, they're about many other things. So I do worry, actually, and there are increasing numbers of people that are doing home learning. I do worry about it, actually. People have their choice, but my view is that you get a lot more in a good school than at home.
Okay. And is there any, why do you think that they're choosing to homeschool?
So that's a really interesting question. And at the moment, I think we have a bit of a crisis, actually, in terms of attendance generally. So last year, we had some of the biggest rates of non-attendance, of persistent absence across the school system than we've had for decades probably. And a lot of teachers I talk to about this, they think that something has changed, right, during the pandemic, that a lot of families, for whatever reason, are now making choices that saying, well, we're not going to send our children into school, right? And now I don't know quite why that's happening, but I certainly think it's one of the big issues that's facing the education system. So I think there seems to be out there, among some families anyway, a changing sort of opinion about whether their children should go to school. What's driving that? I don't know, actually, but it worries me.
Do you not think it might be that during the pandemic they saw some of the lessons online and they weren't very impressed, perhaps, and then they got worried and decided to pull their children out and homeschool?
Possibly. I know some people talk about the rising levels of anxiety among both parents and children. I don't think that's the whole reason. And a lot of school teachers I talk to say, well, actually, we've got to make our schools better. Actually, some teachers will say to me that actually this is a sign that we're not doing good enough.
Right. Right. Well, yeah. So it would suggest maybe. Because of course parents don't really get into lessons, into the schools normally. But I suppose through the pandemic they were sort of in lessons to a certain extent. Maybe. Yeah.
No, I think parents. In the book, I talk about some parents who were starting to get more interested in their children's development. Yeah. Right. So they were starting to look. It's quite scary, I think, for some schools where they were looking at some of the material online about child development and what's expected at different ages, and they were sort of going to go into their parent-teacher meeting with some really quite hard questions. And I think that maybe that dynamic between parent and teacher might be changing, actually.
One thing I think we may disagree on, I'm not sure, is your approach to the digital world. You were sort of saying we need to teach them, well, and I'm not against what you say about the idea of being responsible and where the good sites are and so on. And I suppose you can do that, but the key thing I'm always saying to our parents is, you have to be watching that screen at all times. That if you're not, they are doing all sorts of nonsense, and they maximize the homework that we've given them, and they're busy doing that, and then you walk into the kitchen and they minimize and maximize Snapchat, you know? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I might be a bit guilty here as the sort of professor who looks at all the theory, and I'm just conscious you probably see it much more on the front line, if you like. But I tried to review what research was out there on these different issues, and one of the things that came across in that research was the researchers were suggesting that it's better to have a discussion with your son or daughter rather than trying to police it. That came, just telling them not to do it and almost sort of being sort of policing it, the researchers were arguing it is less productive in a family environment. Now, I don't think that was a school environment, to be honest, but I do worry, I have to say, you know, with the amount of digital, I'm trying to think what the word would be now, but, you know.
They're an easy babysitter. That's the thing. Whatever age the child, it's so easy to just give them the phone or give them the laptop or tablet, and then it keeps them busy. You know, you might see people in a restaurant, and then, you know, two people, they want to have a conversation, and they just give the toddler the phone. And I'm always wanting to go up and say, take the phone away, you know, because my worries are always, if your child, especially at such a young age, is on the phone all the time with all those colors and pop-ups and explosions and so on, it's very difficult for a book to compete with that. And the book is flat and black and white. And then when your child finds that boring because they'd rather be on their tablet, you'll say, well, he never really took to reading, but actually he didn't take to reading because you gave him the phone. What do you think? Do you think I'm being too harsh?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the only thing I'd say is that we don't know what the future holds, and I suppose it's going to be increasingly digital. So I'm just conscious that, you know, I mean, I love books. You know, I do think children should read books, but increasingly they're going to have digital sort of skills as well, I suppose. And I've had some interesting discussions with teachers over the years about, for example, you know, with families, should we put subtitles on all films, for example, on TV? Because again, I haven't seen research on this, but we were sort of thinking, well, actually, in the homes, if you just saw words, even though if you were looking at a screen, would that be just slightly better than just looking at a screen? So, you know, I think you've got to think of improvised ways. I mean, I think when I wrote that book, a lot of people enjoyed it, but I think it's quite high expectations in there. You know, I'm sort of saying, right, you've got to sit down for 15 minutes with your children reading. And I suppose I'm just conscious that parents are under a lot of pressure. So I'm always trying to think of what are the practical ways you can do these things. But 15 minutes is not, for me, that's not a long time, you know?
No, it isn't. But of course, when you have 4 children, it becomes more difficult. But the thing is, all the research shows, certainly all of my anecdotal experience, is that if you don't do that, your child, unless he's exceptional in some kind of way, is going to struggle later. And that those early years are just so important.
Absolutely.
They're so important because we get them at 11, and then we're trying to get them to read at their chronological reading age, and it's so hard. And the thing is, even though we find that we'll catch them up, they don't ever love reading. You know, if a child has struggled for so long with reading, even if the school manages to catch them up, and I have to say, often that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, just across the country, to then get to a point of loving reading, if they haven't loved it before age 6, and when I say loved it, not necessarily that they were these great readers, but they liked books, they liked the pictures, they liked turning the pages, all that sort of stuff. And of course, as you will know, the reason why reading is so important is because you can follow a narrative. You're able to let your imagination go wild in imagining what's going on. Whereas if you're on Snapchat just watching some video for 20 seconds where somebody's being insulted or whatever it is, you're not getting to grips with the characters. You're not feeling sad for one of them and happy for the other one, and so on. So
I'd say it's even more. The scandal for me is that there are many young people who leave school who aren't able to actually digest a trained timetable. Like, according to the statistics that we produce nationally, and everyone's always surprised at this, but, you know, literally being able to read, I know, a household bill or whatever it is. Yeah. So I guess I'm interested in almost that functional level. Now, I agree with you that you also want people to enjoy the narrative and all that stuff, but I think we're even at a point where we're not addressing those what I would call functional skills. Yeah.
Yes. And a lot of people don't realize just how many people are in that situation. Absolutely. Like I imagine our viewers will listen to you and think, oh, it's not that bad, come on. Or there's a couple of people, but not very many.
Yeah.
And actually it's a far bigger problem than we realize. And then for their whole lives, they are then at a huge disadvantage.
Absolutely.
And it's very hard for an adult to catch up on that. Okay, now what's the hardest thing you think about parenting?
What would you say is the hardest?
That's a really good question. Do you know, I was thinking while we were talking about reading, I think consistency, and when you go to really good schools, one of the things you find is it's consistent, right? And I think we all live complex lives, and I think as a parent you just got to sort of be so consistent in a way in your support, and I think we're all kind of human. So I think,
explain what that means. How can a parent be inconsistent and then consistent? I mean, if you give an example. I mean, I think I know what you mean, but go on.
Well, I'm just thinking for me personally here, for example, just reading, one of the things we know about reading is that sort of 15 minutes a day, but it's doing it daily. And we know all these things work if they're done routinely, consistently. And I think as parents, we just have ups and downs. So there's some weeks I remember I probably wouldn't sit down with my children,
Yes.
and then I'd come in. So I do think that is quite difficult. And schools, I think probably, if they're good,
Yes.
probably get that. So I think that would be one of the things I would say.
I mean, it's interesting because I was interpreting your consistency point, which I agree with, more along the lines of both parents need to be consistent with each other. So when people talk about families that are split, for instance, I always think one of the big reasons why some of those children from split families can find it more difficult to succeed is because of the inconsistency that creates between the parents. And that if the parents are split, some good advice for them is, okay, you've split up, it's a sad situation, but to make the most of it, still be consistent as parents. So if bedtime is at 9 o'clock, both of you need to make sure bedtime is at 9 o'clock. Or if you think that they shouldn't watch TV after 9 or they shouldn't be online after 9, both of you say that. And if you can get the similar consistent approach, it's almost like they're in the same household, right? And I always think that's the thing that really, like when they say two parents need to be there, it's because when they're in the same household, they're far more likely to be consistent with each other. And when they're in different households, there is less consistency. What do you think about my...
Well, the research is really interesting on this because I looked it up for the book, and you're absolutely right. If you have parents that are inconsistent, it's not good for the children. It's no surprise there. I think what was a relief in some ways was that even if one of you is helping, it is better than none of you. But you're absolutely right. That's more important than whether in a way you're living in the same home is there consistency. And I can tell you, having teenagers as well, you really need it when they become teenagers, because then there's all sorts of barriers that they're pushing on that I think you need. I'm not perfect on this, by the way, but
no, obviously we're not.
I think that's the thing with these discussions. We're all I think for me it's about trying to be consistent. But you need to talk with each other, whoever the parents are. Certainly, I think that is true. Yeah. What are your rules in a way as a family, if I can put it that way?
And of course, I've always think, my experience as a teacher and headmistress is that's because children, as you said earlier, love routine. They love predictability. They feel safe in an environment which they know. And when a parent or parents are unpredictable, they then the next time don't know what to expect, and that is quite frightening for a child. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think so as well. I mean, I was thinking as well with this conversation is as parents, you've got to get the balance right. So, we got some extra tutoring for our children when that was needed. But I think we were very conscious that we didn't want that to become just a big part of their lives in the sense of becoming dependent on tutor. Because for some young people, I worry that it's just, oh, well, I can't do this, get a tutor, and actually what you want them to become is independent learners. So I think just for parents, you've got to get...
So tell me the details around the tutor. How did you deal with that situation and not wanting to make them dependent, but also wanting to use a tutor?
Well, one of our children was just struggling in one subject, and so we actually got a student, a PhD student, to help us, and that was interesting. Because I know all the research, but when you actually do these things, it's kind of interesting when you kind of live it. And often with tutoring, it's the chemistry actually between whoever the tutor is and your child that matters. So, but that was done. I don't know, we did it for about 10 weeks, I think, and then.
So you think short bursts?
Well, the evidence would suggest around 10 weeks of tutoring can help.
What, longer doesn't help? That's interesting. I don't know.
Well, I suppose less than 10 weeks, the evidence would suggest that, it's not as impactful. And it's interesting. I don't know if you've had the National Tutoring Program here. This is the government program for that. One of my worries with that is the tutors that were being used, did they do it for 10 weeks? Because if you do less than that, I think the impact's going to be quite less anyway. But yeah, I think you've got to sit down with your children and sort of reassess, I suppose, what the needs are. It's very difficult as a parent, I think, because you love your children, right? You want the best for them, but you've got. Would you call it tough love? I struggle with this because I tend to be more towards the loving side, and my partner tends to be more towards the tough side. Maybe it works, I don't know, but I think you probably do need both. And I do worry with some of the middle class families that I meet that it's gone over the top almost, that they're too much support, and that
right.
there's.
When you say too much support, what do you mean?
I suppose more tutoring. I mean, there is. I've said this before, and people have thought it's controversial, but there's a lot of cheating that goes on in. So this educational arms race that we spoke about. I think parents feel under so much pressure to do the best for their children that they will engage in things like tutoring, but they're also, they might sort of rent a flat near a sort of destination, a school that's sought after. Yeah. They might help their children with an essay. That I did a big thing on personal statements. So when you apply to university, you have to do this 500-word statement. You have to sort of sell yourself. Increasingly, I'm finding that when I talk to people, it's often the parents that are writing that rather than the child. Now, I think you can give some help, you can edit, but if you give too much help, I think then your son or daughter is going to end up, at some point, they're going to have to live on their own, right? So I think good teachers, for me, it's all about creating what I would call independent thinkers, learners, right? And that's what teachers do. I don't think parents quite understand that sometimes, and I think they overhelp, and the children will at some point are going to have to fend for themselves.
So to wrap up, let me ask you for if you had one piece of advice to give to parents, what would it be?
I think for young children, I think reading would be my number one.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, if you really pushed me on I think that, because it's such a basic
for young children.
For young children.
And for the older ones?
What would I say to parents? I'd have to think about that. I mean,
you wouldn't say reading again?
Well, we know actually post-pandemic that there are many children who do not have what we would call foundational literacy in early secondary school. So that's basically being able to write a sentence properly. Yeah. So maybe it is reading and writing, if that's the one thing you could give you. I mean, the other thing, I suppose, and it's hard to really define this, it is having that sort of confidence to advocate for yourself. When I talk to students, I talk about assertiveness. I talk about being assertive, not being arrogant, but sort of, I suppose, just asking for things, and I think there's something about that I see a lot in, I suppose, successful people in all walks of life. Yeah. It's that sort of ability to just be assertive and go for things, I suppose. It's that confidence. Yeah. So if you can instill that in your child, right, whatever they do, I think that is an amazing thing, and how you do that is another question. But I think, again, that is an aim. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I wouldn't have thought of it necessarily myself, but it's a good one. All right, Lee, thanks so much for coming along.